Good afternoon and welcome to the April 23rd edition of American Literature by Video, presented by Grace Christian Academy. I hope this video finds all of you in good health and surviving our shutdown in some relative degree of sanity. I also hope that it finds all of you busily working on your end-of-course essays, which will be turned in soon. I've got some news about that I think you will appreciate, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. But I hope you're busily at work. Some of you have turned in outlines. Those who did, I have returned them to you with my comments. And I hope you're working because you need to be. Let's talk a little bit about your upcoming deadlines. Monday, April 27th, I want to see your first drafts. I intend to review them. I will make comments about them. I expect that they're all going to need a lot of work, but I will do that, get them back to you with comments. Please, 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 even though this is just a first draft, do your spell checking, do your grammar checking, and go over these papers with the rules that we've discussed the past semester or so in mind, so that we'll have good papers. Please do that. So Monday, April 27th, your first drafts. I will get those back to you. Monday, May the 4th, I want your second drafts to be turned in so that I can review those again. I expect a lot of work will have to be done. Remember, as I told you, Walker Percy wrote The Moviegoer, the book we're reading right now, 4 times before it was publishable, and you'll need to do something like that yourself. Now, here's the news I think you will like. I'm extending the deadline for your final essay. It will be due Thursday, May the 14th, rather than Monday, May the 11th. Now that puts me into a jam because I have to have your grades turned in by, I think, May the 17th in order for them to be graded. So that's a real problem for me, but that's what I'm going to do. I hope during that time period, that 10-day period, between May the 4th and May the 15th, those of you who are interested, I will try to schedule some kind of Zoom or some other face-to-face, maybe FaceTime or something, conversation with you to go over your papers. So you've got 3 extra days. I hope that's helped to you. Our final class session will be May the 21st. That is 4 weeks from the day that you'll be looking at this lecture. So we're coming to an end here. A few things about your outlines. Most of you have comments or questions on them that I have raised about different things. Some of you may have a misperception about part of the story in The Moviegoer, and that is, and this is a spoiler if you haven't finished it, Binx did not decide to go to medical school because Lonnie died. Binx had already started medical school before Lonnie died, so that doesn't work. So keep that in mind. I have asked most of you some pretty hard questions. Be thinking about them. Some of you seem to focus particular on an issue of some people being hypocrites. Let me ask you a question about that, and that is possible to be true, and that's, are bad people always hypocrites? Or do some bad people sincerely believe their terrible, awful, hideous ideas? Think that over. While thinking about that, consider Aunt Emily's speech in Part 5 of The Moviegoer about sincerity, and see what you think. So, stick to your outlines as much as you can while writing, but as you write, you may decide that something's wrong with your outline. So think these things over, give them careful thought, and work on persuading me that your opinion of these characters and about various things is the correct one. I will tell you that some of you are expressing contradictory views about some of these characters, which excites me. I'm glad to hear that. And I want to see what you have to say about it. I am eager to read some of your papers based on the outlines I've seen. So I'm having a good time here. I don't know if y'all are or not, but I certainly am. So keep all of that in mind. Also, while you are reading, remember this. We didn't go through all of this just for fun. We did it because it will help you write better papers and better everything else that you write. So keep it in mind. Read it. Follow the rules. Keep them in mind. And go ahead and read these other sections too. They'll be helpful to you. There is a section that's, I think it's entitled An Approach to Style, that will be very helpful to you to read it and think about it and keep it in mind as you are writing your papers. So, I hope that you're doing okay. I'm pleased that some of you are finally starting to ask me questions, and I hope I've been responsive to them. So that's what I've got to say to you right now. For the time being, as far as writing your papers, I'm more of a cheerleader than a teacher, telling you to keep it up, keep going. The finish line is in sight. Now, some of you, and you know who you are because I've communicated with you, have not turned in a lot of your work. I don't know what the problem is, but I have communicated with you about it. Those of you who have not turned in your work to me, I may have no choice but to give you an incomplete as your grade for the course. So get it turned in. Turn in all of these things that have been assigned, and they're all on I grade, so you can go look at them and see what they were. You should have finished The Moviegoer by now. I want to say a few things about it. What was assigned was Part 5 and the Epilogue, where we find out what happens to them. And I want to point out a few things about this. And then on Monday, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's going on in this novel. I hope that you're confused. If you're not confused, if you think you understand everything that's going on in this book, then you haven't read it carefully enough. I've probably read it 5 or 6 times, and I'm confused still by a lot of it, and still find things that I hadn't thought of before. So I hope that you're puzzled by what you've read. I have gathered from some of you that you may be a little bit offended by some of what you read, and that's okay too. But I ask that before you make your final decision about this, you finish the book and we talk about it a little bit. A lot of literary critics and English professors and people like that consider The Moviegoer to be the first really, truly contemporary American novel. What we mean by that is that it's different in a lot of ways than anything that came before it, written in English or written by an American, in the way that it's written, the way that the story is presented, and in the story that it tells. You notice that throughout the novel, Binx basically uses the present tense to tell the story, which gives things a more immediate, you are there right now kind of feel. You notice that he digresses a lot into things that he thought about and experiences that he had in the past, and how they relate to things that are going on presently or how they don't relate. And just from the way they act, there is something familiar to us, something that we recognize about Binx and Kate and some of the rest of them that we don't find in the older novels. We don't find it in any of the pensions who seem like very foreign characters to us. We don't even find it in Gatsby so much, who seem different than we are in some ways. And yet there seems to be something recognizable about, as I said, Binx and Kate and some of the others. So that's one of the contemporary elements to it. Another element is this kind of this feeling of what Binx calls the malaise, the sadness, the uneasiness, the sense of dissatisfaction that seems to fill these characters and that he talks about coming over him all the time. And we may not fully understand what it is, but we've probably felt it, or people we know have felt it, a kind of an unexplained dissatisfaction with life on the part of people who have nothing to be dissatisfied about, who have had comfortable, happy lives, but who find something missing, something not quite right. Or, as Binx put it, it seems like everybody is dead. And that's what is meant by this being perhaps the most contemporary, or the first contemporary American novel. Is this is the first time that we see this expressed. It might also, in my opinion, be the last American novel written that was actually worth reading. I'm not really aware of anything that's been written since then that I considered to be anything more than a pleasant way to spend time in an airport. So let's talk about Part 5 and the epilogue. You'll remember the structure of the novel, that it's spread out over a period of 1 week. And Part 5 is the end of the week. It takes place on Wednesday, which, as we've said, is significant in two ways. First, because it is Binx's 30th birthday. Now, you'll remember when we started talking about this novel that I asked you about 30th birthdays. If you'll remember when we read Gatsby, Nick Carraway observed his 30th birthday. You couldn't call it a celebration, but he observed his 30th birthday. here we find Binx having his 30th birthday. And I asked you if there was someone else, someone really important, that you could tell me who major important things happened to that person when he was 30. And it's someone really important. And I'm curious, none of you have bothered to answer that question yet, so maybe you'll think about it. So, part 5 of the epilogue takes place on Wednesday, which is Binx's birthday, and it's Ash Wednesday. And we start out with Binx being dressed down by Aunt Emily for his irresponsible behavior toward Kate in taking her off to Chicago. And she asks him a series of questions, and he does not tell her what actually happened on the trip. He does not tell him that it was Kate who basically invited herself on this trip. He doesn't tell her about Kate's behavior and their encounter on the train in the way that it actually happened. And instead he just goes ahead and he accepts the blame for all of this, and then leaves the house, where he encounters Kate, who tells him to go home and wait for her. And so that's what he does. He gets in his red MG and he drives to his house in Gentilly, and he sits on the playground of the elementary school because none of the children are in school because it's a holiday, it's Ash Wednesday, and waits. And he tries to call his office and finds that Sharon is not there. And then he calls Sharon's apartment and finds that she's not there and that she's engaged, and toys with the idea of trying to make an advance toward Sharon's roommate, whom he's only seen once. But at that moment, he sees Kate drive up in her car. And he goes and he sits in the car, and they have a discussion, which you've read. I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about that part of the novel, but first I want to back up a little bit. You will remember back in part 3, when Binx was discussing his ideas about religion and the search, and he writes a note to himself in the middle. He wakes up in the middle of the night, and he writes this note to himself, and I want you to think about it. He says, "Remember tomorrow." And this is, in my edition, it's on page 146, but he says, "Remember tomorrow, starting point for search. It no longer avails to start with creatures and to prove God, yet it is impossible to rule God out. The only possible starting point, the strange fact of one's own invincible apathy, that if the proofs were proved and God presented himself, nothing would be changed. Here is the strangest fact of all." Remember, he's saying that he doesn't think he'd believe in God even if God appeared. And then he says, "Abraham saw signs of God and believed. Now the only sign is that all the signs in the world make no difference." Now listen to this sentence. "Is this God's ironic revenge?" He asks a question. Is this God's revenge on mankind for their unbelief, that now they can't believe? Even if his existence were proven, even if he appeared, they can't believe. Binx says, "But I am on to him. Now, to me, that passage reminded me of passages in the gospel where people asked Christ for a sign and he told them they weren't going to get one. And then he says, how he told in the tale of Lazarus and the rich man that people wouldn't believe even if someone returned from the dead. Here, Binx is saying, is this somehow God's punishment on us, the inability to believe? Is this somehow God's punishment? Keep that thought in mind. And then I want you to turn to the end of part 5, which is really, in one sense, the end of the main part of the story, where Binx is sitting in Kate's car outside of a Catholic church on Ash Wednesday. And they're talking about getting married, and they're talking about how they could make the marriage work. And Kate's sitting there, as has been her habit through the novel, picking at her finger until it bleeds. And Binx takes her hand up, and he kisses her hand and kisses the blood. But while they're sitting there, they have seen a Negro man, an African-American man, pull up behind them in a fancy car. Now realize this is the 1950s, and the idea of a middle-class African-American was unusual, especially in New Orleans. But here came this man in a fancy car. He got out and went into the church, and Binx continues his discussion with Kate. And then he takes her hand and he kisses the blood. You should ask yourself why that's important that he does that. And then he says, the Negro has already come outside. His forehead is an ambiguous sienna color and pied. It is impossible to be sure that he received ashes. When he gets in his Mercury, he does not leave immediately, but sits looking down at something on the seat beside him. A sample case? An insurance manual? I watch him closely in the rear-view mirror. It is impossible to say why he is here. Is it part and parcel of the complex business of coming up in the world? He's asking himself, is he just doing this because this is what respectable people do? Is it part and parcel of the complex business of coming up in the world? Or is it because he believes that God himself is present here at the corner of Elysian Fields and Bon Enfants? Or is he here for both reasons? Through some dim, dazzling trick of grace, coming here for the one and receiving the other as God's own importunate bonus? It is impossible to say. So, at one point, Binx is speculating that the unbelief is a form of irony on God's part. That, okay, you wouldn't believe, now you can't, even though you should. Here, at the end of this day, he is speculating the opposite direction, saying, perhaps through, as he puts it, some dim, dazzling trick of grace, God causes people to believe who might not have, who came for some other reason. Is that what God's doing? And his answer is what? His answer is, it's impossible to say. So, that's the end of the main part of Binx's story. But we're not done yet. You have the epilogue, which takes place about a year and a half later. And And in the epilogue, we have some interesting things happen. He tells us that, of course, this was on Ash Wednesday. It would have been very late February or perhaps early March. He says the next June he and Kate were married, and he left his business there at the stock brokerage because Sharon, who has also gotten married, is able to take over the business. He tells us that he sells his duck pond or his duck club to the real estate developer for a large sum of money. And then in September, he goes and begins medical school. And Kate buys a house near her stepmother, and they move in and begin life. And he tells us that the following Mardi Gras, about a year later, Uncle Jules has a heart attack and he dies. And then in May, his half-brother, Lonnie Smith, dies of some kind of virus. Remember the Smith children, who Binx has steadfastly referred to through the novel as his half-brothers and sisters. And from there, from him telling us this, we go to a scene that should remind you of the beginning of the novel. You'll remember at the beginning of the novel, we see Binx as a young boy behind a hospital, walking in the street behind a hospital with his aunt, who's informing him that his brother has died. In the epilogue, we see Binx, now with Kate along with him, going out into the street behind the hospital where his mother's car is parked to do what? To inform his half-brothers and sisters that their brother, their full brother, Lonnie, is going to die. And he has this discussion with them about it, and one of them says, and this is a little passage here that I'm going to read to you that is very evocative, if not an actual absolute copy of a scene from a very famous novel, perhaps the greatest novel ever written, called The Brothers Karamazov. This scene is almost lifted from there, but no one cares. He says, Doniste casts about. Binx, he says, and then appears to forget. When our Lord raises us up on the last day, will Lonnie still be in a wheelchair, or will he be like us? Well, now, throughout all of this, Binx has talked about his absolute unbelief. But the answer he gives them is this. He says, he'll be like you. You mean he'll be able to ski? The children cock their heads and listen like old men? Yes. So, let's ask ourselves, what has happened to Binx? Perhaps it's impossible for us to say, but what has happened to Binx? One thing that we know has happened is this. He talks things over with Kate. He sends her to do an errand, and he has to give her very detailed instructions because Kate, married or not, Kate is still as crazy as a bedbug. But we see that Binx has been able to do something there. He has been able to make a commitment to someone, and that's Kate. And we see how patient he is with her in asking her to go do this very, very simple little chore. And then he tells us he goes back, goes back to the car because his brothers and sisters are calling him. Notice what he calls them. Not his half-brothers and sisters, but his brothers and his sisters. Now then, y'all have an essay to write. In that essay, I want you to be able to, whatever you say about him, whether you say he's an Emerson or a Jeremiah, you need to think about and somehow explain or account for what happens to Binx. So, there we are. That's the Moviegoer. I think I've said everything that I can tell you about it. So, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope in 10 years you'll pick it up and read it again. Perhaps you'll get more out of it at that time. Now then, your next reading selection, which I'm not assigning yet, it's not assigned until Monday, will be the short story Revelation by Flannery O'Connor. I will tell you this, and some of you have already read it, I know, and so you may be not surprised by this. I expect that you have been or will be very offended by the Moviegoer. But just as I asked you to think about what happens to Binx, I want you to think about what actually happens to Mrs. Turpin as we read this. And I want you to think a little bit about a subject that Binx raised in Part 5, and that is the idea of grace and exactly how it works. I told you when we started the Moviegoer that you were going to view an expression of Christianity that might be somewhat unfamiliar to you, and that's because the people are very, very Catholic, and they act in very Catholic ways. And sometimes the notions they have about different religious topics might be different than what you're familiar with. But think about that. Think about how grace actually works in real people's lives, which is what I think the Moviegoer's about, and it's what I think that Revelation is about. So read, write, be working. I want to see your rough drafts, first rough drafts, and let's be going. Let me know if you have any questions or comments. Until then, have a pleasant weekend. I hope you enjoy your Sunday. Goodbye.